Hi everybody, thank you for joining us this morning for this panel event, like bright and early for conference anyway. My name's Ellie Craven, I'm a senior researcher here at Onward, and I'm delighted to be joined by such a fantastic panel to talk about the importance of energy abundance as the UK works towards its net zero targets. So to my far left, we have Andrew Bowie MP, Shadow Minister in the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. To my immediate left, we have Mike Lockletts, Country Chair at UNIPA. To my far right, we have Daisy Powell-Chandler, Head of Sustainability at Public First. And to my immediate right, we have Hebe Trotter, Vice President of Global Relations at Harbour Energy and former Special Advisor for the Department of Energy.
Happy days.
So the UK is a net energy importer, and our exposure to global fluctuations in prices was exposed when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Since then, the UK has diversified its energy mix, not only domestically, but European sources. But what more can be done to not only ensure the UK's energy security and independence, but to ensure that we have energy abundance? This panel will explore how diversify sources, domestic generation and infrastructure investment can strengthen resilience, reduce vulnerabilities, and support a stable, low-carbon system. I'm going to turn to the panel for some introductory remarks, and then we'll open the discussion up for a Q&A. And where, Andrew, you need to run off at 10:35, so if you'd like to start off first.
Yes. Thanks, Andy. Cheers. Good morning, everybody. Look, this is great. It's an energy-heavy day today. I know Claire's on the main stage. As I walked in, I had a message, please don't say any of this until Claire has said it. So please bide your time in terms of the big announcements that are coming forward today in terms of our energy plan and our low cost of energy announcements, which Claire will be doing from the main stage in about half an hour. But no, I was privileged to serve in the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero alongside Hebe, where she was a special advisor. And every day, I think we went into work with the aim of creating a country that was abundant in energy. And we said at the time, and indeed remain very proud of the fact that we built the first to fifth largest offshore wind farms in the world, generating power into the United Kingdom right now. We did that whilst supporting our oil and gas industry. We legislated for annual licenses in the North Sea, because our view is that we need all of the above if we are to become energy secure, energy independent, to generate the revenue and to create the jobs and to maintain the jobs that we need here in this country. But something has gone dreadfully wrong. The cost of energy in this country is far too high. And one of the reasons for that is the levies and charges that everybody in this country, every business in this country, is having to pay as a result of what was our, but now has been zealously chased by Ed Miliband, the targets that were set on this country through Net Zero 2050, or before that, the Climate Change Act. To the extent that a third of the wholesale cost of electricity is now standing charges in this. I mean, it's insane. It's becoming too expensive to do business in this country because of the cost of energy. You know, you've had 2 oil refineries within the last year closed down in the UK to the point that we only have 4 functioning oil refineries here. We're seeing a Grangemouth-sized event in the North Sea every 2 weeks. We're seeing 1,000 job losses every fortnight predicted over the next couple of years. That is not sustainable. That is not creating energy abundance, and it is making us far less secure. It is absolutely perverse. And I say this as a shadow energy minister, a former energy minister and an MP for Aberdeenshire, that we are importing more and more of the gas that we need from Norway, who are drilling it from the very same sea that we are prevented from exploring and exploiting ourselves. That needs to change. And we need to change our whole approach. And I think we did probably get this wrong again. We didn't interrogate or look deeply enough at the reason that energy bills in this country were as high as they were. So we need a new approach, and that is what Claire, in about 28 minutes, will be explaining from the main stage. So whereas I encourage you to all remain in this room for what will be a fascinating discussion, if you could have one eye on the main hall, I think that might be very useful for everybody.
Yes, please don't everybody get up and leave. Andrew doesn't want to. Mike, would you like to make some opening remarks?
Yeah, thank you. Mike Lockett, head of the UNIPA business in the UK. So UNIPA is an international energy company. We're active in more than 40 countries, but we are focused on Europe. We have more than 16 gigawatts of flexible generation. We're one of the largest natural gas storage operators in Northern Europe. And we're also a global trader of gas via pipeline gas and LNG. And in the UK here, we have 6 gas-fired flexible power stations, a fast-churn gas storage facility, and we operate 2 high-pressure gas pipelines. So putting all that together, we stand for secure, reliable and flexible supplies of energy, the absolute essentials for an economy and for homes and businesses in the UK. But we have to make sure that that is increasingly decarbonised over time. And we have a plan as Uniper to invest some €8 billion between now and the early 2030s. My job as head of the UK is to make sure a significant proportion of that comes to the UK. And the UK is a relatively attractive place to invest, and we need to make sure that continues. That's a big key issue as we go through the next few years in terms of the challenges we face in energy. Our investments in the UK are part of the overall plan to be net zero compliant by 2040 for the Uniper Group, and then complying with the various local rules that each of the nations that we operate in put forward for us. So we're investing in carbon capture and storage, power generation in the UK, renewables and also low carbon hydrogen. And some of our flagship projects really are for the group as Uniper in the UK because of the good support we've had and we continue to have in terms of low carbon investment. So in North Wales, Connah's Quay is an existing power station that we will rebuild with carbon capture, and we announced last month that we've entered into bilateral negotiations with government for that plant. In the Humber region, we have another gas-fired power station at Killingham that we plan to build with, hopefully, and Hebe will talk about it a bit later, hopefully with the advancement of carbon capture in the Humber region, we can then convert that to carbon capture at some point in the future. We're also producing a plan for low carbon hydrogen in the Humber region with our Humber Hub Green project that would help to decarbonise the Phillips 66 refinery that is remaining in the Humber region. And then not far from here in Cheshire, we have an existing natural gas storage facility which we plan to build adjacent to that hydrogen storage. So we really are invested in the UK in the existing form, and we want to be and we intend to be going forward. The key issue we have and the key ask is that we need to maintain that relative attractiveness of the UK. The key attraction is government-backed private law contracts that investors are familiar with. It's quite clear that the majority of the finance that needs to come forward for investment in energy will come from the private sector. The UK's got a great track record, so the capacity market and contracts for difference in renewables have been running for more than 10 years now on that good framework of government-backed private law contracts, and the plan is to use those for dispatchable power agreements, for carbon capture, for low carbon hydrogen production, and whatever the ultimate aim set by politicians and that might or might not be announced, and whoever comes to power after a next election, we understand that there's very often changes of direction, but we have to see a clear line of sight as to where that's going. We need to see a long-term plan and have clarity on that. And importantly, we need to see those business models that underpin investments remaining so that we keep that confidence. So perhaps that sets the tone for the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Hebe, can I turn to you next?
Yeah, hi. Lovely to meet you all. I'm Hebe. As former Minister Bowie had the unfortunate experience of having to deal with me as a special advisor.
Every day.
Overnight, I have suddenly, miraculously become apolitical. But so I now am working for Harbour Energy. We are the UK, or the UK continental shelf's largest oil and gas producer, responsible for 15% of the UK production. And I think it's quite interesting listening to both Mike and Andrew. The definition that we're all landing on for abundance is really sort of plentiful supply, cheap, and diverse, which I think you're going to speak a lot more about the diversity on. So if we take that and we look at what we actually want it to deliver, I think, you look at strong economies, you look at growing economic wealth, good living standards, GDP per capita closely tracking to energy, particularly cheap energy. That is what abundance really has to be, and that's what I think the aim of the discussion is to try and reach. How do we get there? And it really does revolve around having a sensible conversation. And I think for too long, including when we were in power, we weren't having a sensible conversation about it. and it's a bit presumptuous of me to speak for the whole of the oil and gas industry, but I think everybody who does work in that industry would stand with me and say, we don't want it to be either oil and gas or renewables. It has to be both. This is a position where we look to take forward oil and gas alongside cleaner technologies. And in fact, actually, most of the oil and gas companies are investing in cleaner technologies anyway. For instance, we are the transport and storage company for the Viking project, which is a carbon capture, usage and storage project in the Humber, alongside obviously working with emitters like VPI, obviously Uniper, and actually several others in the room, I think, that I've seen. So how do we make this just also not a debate just about electricity? Because when people think of energy, they think of electricity. Electricity is only somewhere between, you'll probably have the answer, but at like 25% of our energy demand. It's very, very little. We need to look at this a lot more broadly. So if you think of, I'm sure many people in this room will know the great energy historian Václav Smil. He says that oil and gas, fossil fuels, is the four pillars of domestic life. So cement, steel, plastics, fertilizers. I'm going to add chemicals in there. You know, it's so much wider than just electricity. So let's have this debate wider. I think we are walking and sleepwalking, as Andrew said, into one of the highest records of energy importation, particularly on oil and gas. 70% of our energy still relies on fossil fuels. That's not something we're going to be able to change overnight. It is important we are moving towards, obviously, cleaner technology, but we still will rely on oil and gas in 2050 or in a cleaner technology environment. And actually, the IEA has now recognised that oil and gas demand is going to grow in the next 25 years globally. Unfortunately, the UK is the only country in the world which is penalising its domestic source of energy from an oil and gas perspective. We face a 78% taxation rate. For companies like ours, it effectively actually turns out as a taxation rate of around 156%. We cannot survive like this. It is impacting our communities, it is impacting our ability to invest in new oil and gas, and that in itself harms our economic security and our energy security. And of course, what that means for our growth as a country that needs economic growth, it is a real impact on there. It still has plenty to offer. The UKCS has we're told it's in a decline. It is in a decline, but it's in a very forced decline. You know, you should see around a natural decline of around 7-8%. We're actually seeing double that at the moment because of energy policy by the UK government. But we also have about £250 billion that we could invest if this were a more stable position. So I think really welcome the conversation today. Let's make it sensible. We must talk about what we can do from cleaner technologies, but have that diversity and recognition of the role that oil and gas will also play. And then let's be supportive of both types of energy, but let's just not penalise domestic industry, which underpins jobs. It underpins the wider energy supply chain, really critical for that clean energy transition. Balance of trade, tax revenues, I could go on. But we're doing all of that just to import the exact same fuel in from abroad. To me, this doesn't make sense, so I really welcome the conversation.
Great, thank you. And Daisy?
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Daisy Powell-Chandler. I'm Head of Energy and Environment at Public First, which is a policy and strategy consultancy. So we help to win arguments using policy, economics, public opinion, and a whole host of other tools. And I am going to switch it up and talk a little bit more about the security aspect of this and the diversity. I feel like party conference is the point to whap out a quote from Winston Churchill. So Winston Churchill said that safety and certainty lie in variety and in variety alone. He said that in the context of having transferred the Royal Navy from fueling their ships with coal to running on oil. And he realised that created a vulnerability because at that point we were importing all of that oil. So what would he think of our system now? Well, I think on electricity, actually, he would be pretty impressed. Electricity has ditched coal on the Conservative watch, moved away towards gas and renewables. Our gas imports have actually gone down over the last few years from about 2/3 to 50%. And that reflects a wider diversification in the way we generate our electricity. So last year, 30% of our electricity came from wind, 26% came from gas, and 14% came from nuclear. So I think you'd be pretty happy about that. And decentralised energy, spreading out our energy generation across the country into much smaller units, has a whole host of other benefits. Just talked to Ukraine, where they are deploying at the most extraordinary pace solar and wind across the country, partly because it's a lot harder to hit with a missile, and partly because it just spreads the load across their grid more sensibly. There is also a whole bunch of cost benefits to that diversification and decentralisation. So it acts as an insurance policy against global gas price spikes. We've all experienced one of those recently, and we all bear the 40 billion quid bill that it cost the government to subsidise that when it all got highly expensive. The OBR reckons that if we remain with the same level of reliance on imported gas, and in fact even internal domestic gas ends up being charged at the same price. So if we have the same reliance on that, then we're facing one of those crises at least once a decade. And that has a cumulative impact on our debt as a nation, which is a major drag on our growth. So there's a real problem there. Whereas what we see with the low marginal cost renewable fuels is that they are gradually driving down costs. So the ECIU put out new figures at the end of last week saying that in the 15% of time units in which gas is no longer on the system, the price is substantially reduced. In fact, we recently published a paper showing that if you could take gas out of the market mechanism for electricity, that would bring down household bills by 65 quid a year. That quarter cost reduction that renewables are driving, that actually is wiping out the cost of incentives and investment the government has had to do in order to put that new capital into the system. Yes, that does include costs of intermittency, but we're going to need to keep working on those, and actually the market is providing in terms of interconnectors, batteries, and the systems that help to manage these more complex processes. On heat, Hebe mentioned the fact that there's a whole load of other things we use energy for, and I just want to briefly talk about domestic heat, because here I think Churchill would be less pleased with us. 85% of Great British households use gas to heat their homes. And at the time when the government, because this didn't just happen naturally, we need to remember it gets talked about as if the status quo is just the natural way that this happened. Government pushed gas. It went street by street and installed it into people's homes because it was better for them than coal and burning wood. It was sold as the cleaner fuel, and it was, but there are now better alternatives than that, and ones that don't leave us vulnerable to the Strait of Hormuz being closed or Russia blowing up pipelines. And I believe Mel Strider is going to announce today that the Conservative Party would cut a bunch of subsidies for things like heat pumps and things like that. I don't think anyone on the decarbonisation side would argue that heat pump subsidies have been a raving success. But we do need some other solutions to help diversify in this particular area. And I would argue that bringing down the price of electricity, which, as Andrew has described, is well within government's power because the government put a lot of that price onto electricity and the government can take it off again, is one of the things that we should be focusing on, as well as introducing more things like demand flexibility and large-scale storage that will help us to be more resilient in the face of security threats.
Great, thank you. We're going to open up for a Q&A now, but I might just be cheeky and take the first question. I think it sounds like we're all on this panel in sort of broad agreement that we need a sensible approach towards securing a low carbon future, but also ensuring low bills and energy abundance. Andrew, I suppose, how can the Conservative Party position itself as this sensible in-between point between sort of the Labour government going arguably too fast, too soon, and other parties on the right of the Conservative Party with nonsensical energy policies?
I don't think that the party to whom you refer is to the right of the Conservative Party. I think that, as Kemi very concisely set out yesterday, that they're a socialist party who believe in state intervention, in fact want to nationalise parts of the oil and gas industry, which is absurd from my point of view. However, back to your question, how can we position ourselves? Because we're pragmatists, right? And I was getting the question this morning, and indeed got it yesterday. How can you, who sat beside Theresa May when she signed Net Zero 2050 into law, and indeed went around the world and preached about the great strides that the Conservative government were taking, moving this country towards a cleaner future, and of course were the party that did put the cost of this transition onto consumers' bills, introduced the renewables obligation, or indeed continued with it, contract for difference, and everything else. And of course, it is quite difficult to hear your speeches being quoted back to you verbatim by government ministers on the other side of the dispatch box. But it's because we're pragmatic that we can change our position. And when times change, when facts change, when the country changes, then we have to change. And that's where we are right now. And that's why we're taking the view that we need a wholesale reset of our approach to our energy security, our energy future, to how we manage the transition and how we become more sustainable. And that starts with repealing the Climate Change Act and getting rid of the Climate Change Committee, and indeed looking to how we produce, support, encourage, entice energy companies to produce clean energy here, to get to a point of energy abundance and energy security. That's the starting point. And then from that, everything will follow. One of the things that people don't talk about, and maybe don't understand, because I'm privileged to live in and represent a part of the world that has been made very wealthy by the presence of the oil and gas industry. We're very much living the transition in the northeast of Scotland. But a lot of these new technologies, a lot of the technology that's fueling the transition is being developed by those very same companies whose day-to-day job is to explore and exploit fossil fuels within the North Sea. So we need to encourage them to maintain their presence in the United Kingdom, continue that technological advancement, because if we do not, and we punish these companies and force them to leave the UK, as is happening right now, because these jobs, these technologies don't have to be based in Aberdeen, they can be based in Riyadh or Dubai or Australia, Indonesia, Mexico, Canada, the USA, any other country with an oil and gas industry, then we will lose the skills and the technology, and the transition in this country will falter and stop. And that's what we're seeing in the North Sea right now. Things have slowed down to the extent that we're a historic, certainly in recent times, low in terms of investment into renewables because of our policy on oil and gas. So it's because we're pragmatic, and the Conservative Party has always been the pragmatic and sensible party, and that is the position we're taking on our energy future as well. One other technology we haven't mentioned thus far is, of course, nuclear, and we need to scale up massively our investment in nuclear technology. It's to generate the same amount of power as a nuclear power station. You need a wind farm the size of the New Forest, or a solar farm the size of the Isle of Wight. Nuclear is key to our cleaner, more secure future. Yes, it takes a long time. Yes, it costs rather a lot of money. But we can reduce the cost and reduce the length of time it takes if we get the planning procedures right, and if we can encourage investment into this country. So it's remiss of me as a former nuclear minister not to mention it, but nuclear has a key role to play in our energy secure future that we want to build.
Great, thank you. Hebe, did you want to comment on that?
I just thought I'm going to take the opportunity now quickly to bang my drum. So, obviously, as an MP for Aberdeen Shire, Andrew will see this a lot, but just to really hammer home the point, for a lot of people who might not be based up in Aberdeen, which I'm assuming is the vast majority of you guys, it is a very real threat that we are seeing to the communities in Aberdeen. Sadly, we had to make 250 people redundant earlier this year, as on top of an earlier 350 people. That is half of our workforce in Aberdeen sadly gone, a direct result of the fact that we are being taxed at a level that means that we cannot invest, we cannot keep production going, and we cannot keep people employed. What's even worse is that 80% of revenues for energy supply chain companies still come from oil and gas. That needs to change. That obviously needs to transition over time. But it's not going to happen tomorrow. So if we're going and we're not putting the contracts in, we're not creating the projects that these companies can rely on, they're also not going to have the funding that is going to be able to go into that wind project, that carbon capture project, the transition technologies. So if we do this too quickly, we will lose the ability to build up on the other side, because we will reach that gap that we cannot bridge. So absolutely, we need to have diversity. We need to be pushing towards cleaner technologies, but we must do it at a pace that enables the transition to happen properly.
And the just sorry to cut across. the story that Hebe tells of Harbour is very, very sad for that company, but they are one of many companies that are downsizing.
We're not alone.
BP are the same. Shell and Equinor upstream will cease to exist in the UK. They are combining to create a new company because Shell and Equinor, the state energy company in Norway, could not have a future independent of each other. That is how bad the situation is in the North Sea right now, and that is terrifying to those of us that represent these companies, these people that are working there, that are being laid off in their hundreds, and indeed those of us that also take a keen interest in how we produce energy in this country moving forward.
Great. Coming on that, Ellie.
Yeah, of course.
So I think it is absolutely certain that we're going to carry on using oil and gas. As Hebe referred to, the amount that the North Sea has to yield has been reducing over time. That is a reality that we have to cope with. So the idea that we can just keep pumping more and more out of the North Sea is unfortunately for the birds, and the transition remains important. And I think Andrew mentioned the Climate Change Act, so I feel like it's now fair game. One of the other things that has made the UK appealing for companies over time was the policy certainty that we were able to provide with a world-first act that created a clear transition pathway. There are flaws in the act. There are some things that we could do better. I would really like to see the Conservative Party offering an alternative rather than threatening to tear it up, because what we are actually hearing from some of the many oil and gas companies that you have just named is that there is extreme nervousness around an approach that says, no more Climate Change Act, drill baby drill, because first of all, that's not what their investors want, so they can't fully back that approach. And second of all, that transition investment that Hebe is talking about is contingent on knowing that there will be a regulatory system and a market that backs that investment when they get there. And knowing the time frame for that is really key to those decisions. So I would just, a small plea from me that hopefully Claire's about to get up and say, I promise there is a plan, we're not just burning it to the ground.
And Mike, do you want to come in on that point?
Yeah, just to follow up on that point, because we are one of those investors that faces exactly those issues. And I think there's a couple of words I'd pick out here. The pragmatism, we accept that, and the variety or the diversification, I think is both really key points. And that's what we need as a nation. And we have to keep the lights on, but at the same time we have to drive decarbonisation. And for our own investments, you know, we have our existing fleet is predominantly natural gas based. But our investors expect that we will have a credible plan over time in order to be able to not just have a headline target of 2040 carbon neutrality. We have to have real credible plans and investments that will get us there. And as I said, the UK is really attractive from that point of view. So we must not throw that away. You know, if direction changes and policy changes, let's make sure there's a long-term credible plan, but we keep that support in place overall. And as you said, Daisy, it's not renewables versus gas versus nuclear versus, it's all of the above, and we have to have them. So that diversity and that diversification is really key and really important. But we will invest, and we will invest in, you know, our Killingham site, as I mentioned earlier, we have a plan for a new gas-fired power station. There is as yet no firm commitment to the decarbonisation routes via Viking. We really hope that comes forward. But there's a credible plan, and in the capacity market that would see us building that plant, there's also the ability to switch over to a future dispatchable power agreement under the carbon capture mechanism. Those are the kind of things that give us the confidence to invest in the UK, and whatever happens in terms of the future, in terms of targets and the aims that we have as a nation, we have to keep that investment framework there. It's really important, ultimately, for our investors to back us with those billions that are needed for energy security. And on that security piece, with the broader diversification as well, is something that Uniper's really invested heavily in. We were a large importer of Russian pipeline gas. Europe was too exposed to one single source of pipeline gas. Gas prices are now roughly where they were in real terms before the energy crisis. Russia hasn't turned the gas supplies back on. It's because we've been able to diversify more globally with, for example, quite significantly more diverse sources of LNG to bring energy into Europe, as well as still pipeline natural producers and domestic producers. But that diversification of short-term, over the next few years, that diversification of supply to make sure that we can heat our homes and keep the lights on is also really vitally important as well.
Great, thank you. Got Angus. Oh,
No, number of hands that went
got Angus at the back with the microphone. So perhaps if we
Keen for this time in
take
the morning.
two gentlemen in front of you there. We'll do it in twos.
Thank you. Yeah, very good discussion thus far. My question for Andrew and the rest of the panel would be, I think there's maybe a real gap at the moment between what we're starting to say, that if we produce more oil and gas in the North Sea, which I would be supportive of for the reasons that have been said so far, that we can then reduce bills for consumers and industrials. We know that a little bit more gas and oil from the North Sea will have no impact, it will be a negligible impact on a global oil market and a global gas market. And because gas sets the power price, also won't impact electricity prices. So what is the mechanism we're thinking of to translate more oil and gas in the North Sea down to some, reduced prices for some types of consumers?
Great, if you pass it to the gentleman in front of you. Thank you.
Yeah, Evie talked about having a sensible conversation, and I was listening to BBC Radio 4 PM on Thursday. I heard Claire Cusino, and most of what she said was great, lovely stuff. But she said that in 2021, the price of offshore wind was £41 a megawatt hour. But this year it's £117 per megawatt hour. Now, I'm quoting the figures that she gave on the PM programme. There's two problems with that. First of all, we don't know what the wind prices are this year because AR7 hasn't closed. We won't know until December. The second problem is that the prices this year will be quoted in 2024 prices, and the price of £41 in 2021 was in 2012 prices. So, okay, Claire made a bit of a boo-boo. But my question really is, how can we, the debate is, to members of the public, they just hang on to a number like that and they go, oh, well, wind costs 3 times as much as it did 4 years ago. How can we improve the quality of the debate by giving numbers that are actually real and make sense?
Great, thank you. So we've got two questions there, one on oil and gas and how that trickles down into energy prices, and the second about the sort of the general rhetoric of this debate in the public discourse. Andrew, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, so actually on oil and gas, I've never said, some people have said that producing more of our oil or exploiting more of the fossil fuels that we have in the UK continental shelf will automatically mean lower bills. For me, the oil and gas debate is about creating energy security moving forward, maintaining the jobs and generating revenue. The whole piece on how we reduce bills is connected but separate. There's a whole host of other things we need to do to start reducing bills in this country. And although it helps if we have an abundance of our own oil and gas, that is not the key that will unlock a cheaper future. What will is our cheap power plan, which is going to be announced in 4 minutes' time. From the literally counting down the minutes now from the main stage by Claire. On the second point about the quality of debate, I completely agree. And actually, one of the things that we did not do through our time in government was actually engage enough with the public to talk about what net zero 2050 actually means, what it will mean for the cost of energy, what it will mean to you for your day-to-day life, what it will mean the changes in your landscape for many rural communities, seeing battery storage facilities, wind farms, pylon upgrades, etc. We never had that discussion or that debate. So whilst the majority of people say, yeah, we want to get to net zero, but they don't actually know what that means. And so in a whole host of areas on the debate around energy, climate and the future, we need to have that education piece, that discussion piece, so that communities in this country feel that it's being done with them and not to them when we actually engage in this transition.
Great, thank you. Would anybody else like to come in on those questions?
Yes. I have so many thoughts. I'm going to try and keep them brief though. I'm actually going to take them together because I think there's a really important point in here about the way we talk about oil and gas versus renewables. And actually even renewable prices over time, which is implicit in your question, which is that when we first invest in something, we pay a lot of upfront capital and then we pay that off over time. And at the end of that, with a gas power station, you then pay a fuel cost. And with renewables, you don't pay a fuel cost. And also, gas is a much more mature technology, which is one reason why it's really lovely that you can whack up a gas power station, if you can get the parts, mind you, because the supply chains are currently just as gummed up for that, possibly more so than they are for renewables, because we're all trying to build them. The problem with that is when you're comparing prices, you're not comparing like with like a lot of the time, because you're comparing gas power stations, many of which were built decades and decades ago and have paid off all their capital, but they are paying a fuel cost that is highly variable, so from month to month it might be different, to renewables where we've had to pay quite a lot to get the industry up and running, and we're still paying off some of those costs on bills, but they're now getting much cheaper, but then they're not paying a fuel cost. So it is really hard to come up with numbers that are sensible to compare. But I think there is a broader point here that Andrew mentions about explaining what all of this means, and I do think there is a real honesty point in which I completely disagree with Andrew, which is that at no point do we say, oh, do you know what, we should really go and explain to the country what our defence policy means and why that means we have to build X Defender or X tank. We would have to build a hell of a lot more pylons, whether we were doing net zero or not, because we all want electricity. We had this argument back when we built the grid, and we should have it now, but we should have it on the honest basis that most of us would like electricity in our homes. We want to build new businesses that require electricity, and we would like to be more energy secure, which in the current world, if you want to do most efficiently, means you're also going to build a bunch of energy storage. So this is not about being honest with people that net zero means we need to build all over their landscape. This is about being honest that we are in a world that is gradually electrifying. We have a bunch of other things we're going to use oil and gas for. We still need to get electricity to people's homes.
Sorry, I apologise, I'm going to have to run.
Thank you.
Aforementioned speech.
Thank you for joining us today, Andrew.
Thank you.
Anybody else got some questions? Angus, maybe take the three at the front here.
Shame, he was always going to get all the questions.
These three are going to be really disappointed down here.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Alex. I host the largest energy podcast on Apple, the Wolf Power Club, and I'm also chair of the Spectator Energy Summit on the 24th of November. The question I've got is that China has spent 15 years investing in solar and storage. The likes of America, their real tax rate is about 40% on energy companies. And we've also seen this year the likes of the Elliott Group forcing BP and P66 to change direction with how they feel that investment should go. So looking at the trends of the market and whether it's changes to the energy profit levy, what do we want the British Treasury to do, like China and America, to support the British energy industry? And just to be clear, I'm energy agnostic, but it's fair to say my colleague at The Spectator is a son of Aberdeen, so yeah.
Hi, I'm Caroline Newton, and I'm at the Society of Chemical Industry, which has a lot of, as you will understand, very energy-intensive companies within it. And I really welcome this conversation, and it's fascinating. I don't think this time last year we would have been having a conversation where there was so much agreement on this subject. I have one question, well, two questions really, one of which is a sub-question about carbon capture, and just urging an understanding that so much of the chemistry and the feedstocks on which we rely in this country come from fossil fuels, and a loss of our fossil fuel industry will mean a catastrophic loss of all of that. But my other question actually relates to the fact that we have a real difference in how we look at energy prices for domestic and energy prices for industry. And industry is being really clobbered partly as a way of subsidising domestic costs. How are we going to address that extraordinary cost that is being faced by industry? And we're seeing industry closing down the whole time because of it.
Thank you.
Hi guys, Floyd March, energy correspondent at DC Thomson. So my question on the panel, we've obviously spoken a lot about abundance today, but I just wondered what the panel's thoughts on the role in hydrogen, specifically with curtailment costs and the massive curtailment issue with offshore wind, whether hydrogen can help enable that, and whether repealing the Climate Change Act will incentivise industry to invest in hydrogen technology for such issues?
Thank you. So before we get on to those questions, I should just say that we've been joined by our wonderful director, Sir Simon
Hello.
Clark, to take Andrew's place for the...
It was a seamless swap. I think.
Yeah. So a couple of questions there. First on sort of what role should the Treasury be playing and what parts of the energy transition should it be supporting? Then one on commercial energy prices, with especially a focus on intensive industry. And then the role of hydrogen. So would anybody like to take those
Pick up
first?
the hydrogen one first, if
Yeah.
I can. So obviously we're an investor in hydrogen as well, and but one of the key issues with hydrogen is we have to get that going at scale if we really want to make it work. I mean, if you're an industrial user, and Caroline's a lot of your members, we talked to many of them around, especially in the Humber region. We have a plan for a green hydrogen production unit specifically for Phillips 66, but we had much larger plans for blue hydrogen linking into carbon capture, which could decarbonise much further and wider. The issue is, it's the concern about if you're an end user, unless there's a proper transport network that will bring diverse supplies of hydrogen in, and unless there's a storage system that will guarantee you security, you're not minded to make the investment to convert your processes ultimately at the end of the day. So I think there is longer term a big role for hydrogen in the UK economy, and it could well play a big part in exactly as you said. If we cite green hydrogen production, classic example, you cite it in the north of Scotland, where we often see curtailment there's a lot of renewable energy there. You've then got to transport it and store it. So you're switching an electrical grid north-south transportation issue in that example to a hydrogen grid north-south transportation issue. So yes, a very clear role for hydrogen there, provided that you've got the hydrogen network to bring at-scale hydrogen from north to south. So you've still got the investment issue of making sure you've got the infrastructure that can handle it. And that's one of the key points actually around this whole issue of affordability and reliability of supply. You have to have coordinated infrastructure investment. We see this specifically ourselves. We're very happy to invest significant amounts of development spend into hydrogen, into carbon capture and storage. But to have that overall economic impact for the UK in the most cost-effective way, we want to see, for carbon capture and storage, we want to see chemical industries coming forward, cement industries coming forward, and yes, power generation and hydrogen industries coming forward. Because only if we've got that joined up coordinated infrastructure, and only if it's fully made use of, do we really start to see the overall economic benefit and then the knock-on impact in terms of more effective use of the assets and lower overall bills. And that's very definitely a role for government in terms of that coordination of wider infrastructure.
Great, thank you. Simon, did you want to pick up any of those points?
Yeah, well, I think the most helpful one is probably to talk about the Treasury dynamics in terms of oil and gas. And the statistic which we ought all to have in mind today, because it goes to Hebe's point, really, that the North Sea is a declining basin, but it's declining faster than it would otherwise do were it not for policy costs, is that the current marginal tax rate on income from UK oil and gas extraction is 78%, and that does sit within the Treasury's gift. And so, were we to be in a world where we were pivoting towards a much more supportive attitude to oil and gas extraction, then moves to progressively normalise the treatment of UK oil and gas would be the single biggest thing that we could do. And that doesn't necessarily mean you put oil and gas on a complete level playing field with other sectors, but you could move it a damn sight closer to normal corporation tax. And if you did, then jobs and investment would follow. I think, obviously I don't speak for industry in this regard, but the window to do this is really narrow and narrowing. And I think that's the other thing which we need to have in mind today. Obviously, the next election is probably not until 2029. A lot of this damage will be a sunk cost by that point. But I do think that if we're serious about showing that oil and gas have a at least medium-term future as part of our energy mix, which I profoundly believe that they ought to, certainly in preference to imported oil and gas, then we do need to look above all else at the tax levers, because that is where we have piled on the pain. And insofar as there was a windfall situation a few years ago, there isn't now. And I think there's a very clear case, therefore, to act to change things back to a more normal tax regime.
Well, Simon says he can't speak on behalf of industry, but Hebe, I suspect you can.
Just apolitically.
But apolitically. No, so my biggest request to HMT is obviously to remove the EPL. But I think, again, the oil and gas sector wants to be pretty pragmatic. We recognise that it was a really difficult time when oil and gas prices did go sky high. And actually, we agree that there does need to be protection for there. So this gets a bit technical, apologies. We are currently consulting with Treasury about what a replacement could be. So that would be for when prices go sky high, then a similar sort of windfall tax would come in. The problem is that the rates that we're discussing, we welcome, but that wouldn't technically come in until 2030. The industry doesn't have between now and 2030 to survive at a 78% cost. And it's 78%, but actually, given the amounts of changes and the types of, or the way that tax falls on companies, as I said, we faced an effective tax rate last year of 156%. So yes, it's 78%, but the way it hits your business can be much more damaging. So that's number one. I think to pick up on carbon capture, which has to be the way to help companies, chemical companies, cement companies in some of our most industrial heartlands decarbonise, but not totally deindustrialise. We want to keep them here. Is we need to continue to have that stable framework going forward for carbon capture, and that is critical. We were sad to see that there wasn't the route forward for us at the last spending review for the Viking and the Acorn carbon capture hubs, which are both in Aberdeen and Humberside, as I mentioned earlier. We would want to see that coming forward at the next spending review, so that would be, we would like to see it in 2027 at the interim spending review. The sooner we can do that, the earlier we are able to go and get those jobs and those spades in the ground. Without that certainty, we honestly don't know if those projects will be able to go forward. It's very difficult for a company to just sit there with heavy fixed costs and nothing to do. And then finally, it's actually not for HMT, it's for DESNZ. There's been a lot of speculation. If you go to page 13 or something of the business section of the newspaper about what Ed Miliband will do about licenses. We actually do welcome the more pragmatic position it seems they're taking, though I would say this is all speculation at this point. But we must maintain the ability to operate, and that means keeping that pragmatism. So if we see that come forward, the industry will welcome it. It's definitely good news, but ultimately without a change in that fiscal position, there actually won't be the investment to go into it, because no company is able to invest when it's being penalised so heavily.
Thank you. Would either of you like to come in on those points?
Can I just take a step back? I think, again, these three questions are sort of nicely linked, because they speak to an evolving position of how this. I'm still. Hebe wrote down the questions, so I'm not just looking at her notes, but I am basically looking at her notes. I think the three questions are linked because they speak to an evolving position of how we're going to use oil and gas over the coming years. We're still going to be using them. Every credible pathway to net zero, which I still ardently believe we should be trying to reach, says that there will be some oil and gas in the system by then. Mm-hmm. And part of that is going into the four areas that Hebe named. Plastics, cement, fertilizers. I spend a lot of time worrying about fertilizers. And a lot of these we create by smashing together atoms, or sometimes molecules, depending on how lucky we are, to create end products.
I'm glad you know how it works.
I did vaguely start a chemistry degree once. Those atoms, the easiest place to get them is from hydrocarbons in a lot of cases. But we're going to be using them in a savvier way. And that's great news for us, because actually, potentially, that means there's a lot more margin in that. People, if we're making something, there is more margin to be gained on that than just pumping it out of the ground and sending it to people. Mm-hmm. And we have an amazing heritage in this country of chemical industry, which we are slowly killing off with our energy prices. I do 100% recognise that. But what we need to be thinking about, and I think this gives some clues to the point about HMT, is how do we start thinking about early industries that are using new feedstocks to create key goods like fertilizers? How do we transfer the investment that we've been putting into industries over the last couple of decades that were early stage at that point, like wind, which are now mature? And how do we use that kind of investment to invest in new industries like hydrogen that are not mature yet, which I think partly answers your question, and to support the arrival of new innovative products into older industries like chemistry, in order to make sure that we retain industry in this country and that we allow our existing industries to electrify, which is nicer for their workers, substantially more effective, means that we can sell the products cheaper over time, and build a thriving new industrial economy within the UK that people actually are excited to work in.
Okay, Mike, perhaps you want to come in on the point of any asks to the Treasury or to DESNZ. Is there anything from Uniper's perspective?
I think I'm in danger of repeating the ask from earlier. I think the key thing is that clarity and consistency. That's really important from an investor perspective, and maintaining the momentum as well. I mean, just as an example, one of the things that made my job relatively easy last year, and it might sound quite strange, but the collapse of German government. You know, we're a German-owned company who naturally tends to prioritise investments in the home market. You know, German government collapsed. We had a 6-month hiatus on energy policy while the new coalition formed and negotiated its direction. And that allowed me basically to argue very firmly that the UK is, you know, a much better place in terms of stability of policy and stability of direction. And on the back of that, we did get quite a significant amount of investment into the UK to develop our plans around the Humber region. German government's reformed, and now they have their own transition plan, which is predominantly based on unabated gas, removing coal from the system. So they're some way behind the UK in that transition, but they're now very, very active in terms of pushing unabated gas to allow coal to close, which then attracts the headlines again. So the key thing for me, whether it's DESNZ or Treasury, and particularly the spending reviews, are really important because they send really clear signals as to what overall technologies and what overall investment plans are going to be supported. It's that clarity of medium to long-term vision and then keeping the business models behind it that are really important from my perspective. I think another point that links in as well to the efficiency and the overall bills point is, you know, the pragmatism that Andrew mentioned earlier from DESNZ. And although this actually was a NESO example as the National Energy System Operator, but I was really, really pleased to see their definition of clean power was 95%, because going from, you know, and the integration of renewables going from 5% to 25%, the addition of renewable energy is really, really effective because you can absorb it into a system. Going from 95% to 100%, it gets really, really expensive to decarbonise those last few percentage points. So having a plan where you cost effectively allow essentially gas-fired generation to provide that balancing, to provide the security of supply, to keep the lights on, but accepting that it will be 5% is really actually a very pragmatic way to get a cost-effective way of striving for that clean power goal. And I think it really is an important goal to strive for that decarbonisation end result. It's very important from my perspective, but that we keep the lights on whilst doing it, and we keep it pragmatic in terms of the cost-effectiveness of that combination of technologies.
Okay, thank you. I think we will have time for 2 last questions, just 2 gentlemen either side of you, Angus.
Hi, I'm Jack Richardson, Nelson and Sizton. I'm just interested talking about the current technologies of renewables, oil and gas, and touching on hydrogen. But what do you think needs to be done to make sure the UK has a lead in what seems the holy grail of power, fusion reactors?
Yes.
Hi, James from Montfort Communications. Daisy was touching on how we're doing a poor job of decarbonising heating, and we know the grid's going to come under a lot of strain. Should we be looking at options like geothermal to solve the heating problem?
Great, thank
we
you.
saved the best questions for last.
So, question on fusion and geothermal. Daisy, I suspect you'd like to go first on this.
Just a resounding thumbs up to both. Yes, yes, yes. More fusion, more geothermal, and. Abundance.
Yep.
Fantastic. Simon, would you like to come in?
Yay to abundance, definitely. I think it's fair to say that both of those questions go to the same point, which I think is quite an important one in light of what the party is now seeking to do. So if we're saying that we don't believe we can deliver net zero by 2050 without intolerable pain for the real economy, then new technologies represent perhaps a way of getting there pretty quickly in ways which are not currently at our disposal. And I think this is an important aspect of the journey to a really low carbon economy. So without resorting to sort of wishful thinking, I think we ought to be clear that there are things in train, particularly at Culham with fusion, which could totally change the energy economy over the course of the next 10 to 15 years. And whilst you can't predicate your plans on things which aren't yet in place, nor ought you, I think, to build plans on the basis that no new technologies will emerge, because I think it's quite likely that some will, at least, and of course the scale of that and the speed of that are as yet unknowable. But there is a lot of reason, I think, for cautious hope that fusion in particular might ride to the rescue and allow us to decarbonise quite radically in a way which isn't yet open to us. Obviously, in the meantime, you need to double down on the rollout of SMRs and make sure that you concentrate on conventional fusion. Obviously, you want to make sure that where it is cost effective, you roll out renewables, and obviously you ought to be using oil and gas as transition fuels. But you should be mindful, at least, that things could and doubtless will emerge which will change things as well.
Great, thank you. Mike, do you want to comment on any of those points?
I think just to pick up on the point we made earlier about diversification of supply, and it isn't one technology against any other, and we're very firmly supporting that. And we happen, as Uniper, to be in a certain suite of technologies, particularly then moving towards decarbonisation for us via carbon capture, hydrogen and renewables, but we're open to a complete technology mix. It's what we need as a nation in terms of having that diversified, secure supply.
Yeah, absolutely. If there are any other questions, otherwise we'll wrap up on time. Do you have a question, sir?
One thing that didn't really come up during the debate, thank you, was AI. I saw a report in the Financial Times today that suggested that all of the additional growth in the US this year, compared to the rest of the G7, was due to investment in AI by the hyperscalers. And that will also flow through into an increase in household electricity prices over the next few years in the States by about 75%. So I wondered if the UK wanted to play in AI, where was the energy going to come from? How green should it be, and what effect will it have on bills?
That's a really interesting question. Daisy, would you like to come in?
Yes, and I think it links to the last question as well. It's great that we're getting better at doing really complex computation, because as we add more complexity to the grid, whether that's through renewables, whether that's through smaller nuclear, whether that's through fusion, whether that's through geothermal, whether that's through smaller gas plants, this all takes more managing. And one of the things that we're quite good at as a country, we're not very good at admitting the things we're good at, is working out how to run grids as they become more complex. And AI is going to help a lot with that. And I'm really hoping it's going to deal with the problem where at the moment we quite often skip using the newer tech because we know the old stuff better. So it has a lot of positive sides to it, I think, is the first point we need to make in this debate. However, it also requires a lot of energy. Now, first of all, I think there's Simon's point here, which is that actually we should also assume that the tech will get better. Yeah. And already we're seeing AI chips using less energy as they are getting better at optimizing them for that. So it need not always be the way it is now. And there's also the possibility, increasing speculation around the fact that the money flowing into the US at a great speed is actually the sign of an AI bubble. And it might not always be a good thing to be fully in on a bubble. And finally, I would say that actually the way in which our grid has expanded to be more decentralized and have generation in more different places is actually a real benefit for AI, because if you can put a data center next to it, that makes it a lot easier to get a grid connection, which is the main thing stopping data centers from being built more swiftly in the UK. And it also means it's less likely to have a big impact on the grid and the houses and other businesses surrounding it. So one could talk for hours on just that topic, but that's a brief roundup.
Great, thank you. Either of you like to come in on those topics?
Only that AI is obviously going to change everything. The speed at which it's going to do so is extraordinary, and I think any economy which is not part... I agree with Daisy, we oughtn't to be part of a bubble, but we also need to be very clear on the side of the nations that lean into the opportunities of AI rather than leaning out. And actually, Rishi said some really good stuff about this in recent weeks. the reality, therefore, is that, you know, we've been talking for years, we're going to need to triple or quadruple the amount of electricity we produce. Well, we're going to need to do even more than that. And so, you know, the abundance agenda, therefore, just becomes ever more salient. We are not going to be able to do this if we don't have the power. And I suppose, with my sort of housing and planning hat on, we also need to really liberalise planning so that we can actually build the damn things where we need them.
Absolutely. I think we'll probably wrap up on time. Thank you all for coming to this really, really interesting panel discussion. Thank you very much to my panel. I think it was a really great discussion, not only on energy abundance and diversification, but the key word, or one of them, seems to be pragmatism that's come out of this discussion. And I think that is absolutely what needs to be implemented going ahead. So thank you all for joining us today. Onward's got a great programme of events in the next couple of days, so please do come back to the Central 5 if you fancy coming to any other ones.
Thank you.
Thank you.